Okay, if before the Big Bang there was no space and no time, what was there? What about the beginning of the universe from the religious point of view? God created everything. Fine. Where was he before? What caused the Big Bang to happen in the first place? Or what made God decide to snap his fingers or wiggle his nose or whatever he did to make everything happen?
This goes back to your idea of God. What comes into your mind when you think about God is the most important thing about you. And the question of where was God before everything else is kind of a clue that we're thinking about God still in finite terms. God was not anywhere. What was God do? God is infinite and personal. That's the biblical Christian worldview. And being infinite, there is no explanation for God's existence other than himself. He's just sort of, God is. And that might not satisfy some of our maybe modern thinking where we want things to be clearly defined. We're afraid of mystery. But that's the best explanation for God. God is infinite. God is personal. If we take either one of those things away, then we kind of muddle through trying to explain questions like this. Like, where was God before everything? God is infinite. There's no where. God doesn't exist like that. Sorry.
If you ask a physicist to explain what existed before the universe, they'll give you an answer about quantum foam, dark energy, or something just as bonkers as the Big Bang. Ask a theologian what existed before God created the universe, and you'll get an answer equally as confusing. But
okay, fair point.
What does make sense is that the universe was just sitting there dormant. Then someone somewhere decided to boot up a program. Our program are all the laws of the universe. Electromagnetism and gravitational force are written into the program. The speed of light gets a value. There's code for Planck's constants of mass, speed.
Written into the program, there's code. Great book to read and or documentary to look at is called The Privileged
In time. Avogadro's number is in there, along with a bunch of other rules that govern the behavior of everything that exists. All part of our program. Even consciousness itself is part of our simulation. If you've never heard of simulation theory, then this might sound far-fetched. But some of the world's most respected scientists, technologists, and philosophers believe that it is more likely than not that we are living in an artificial reality. So, how do we prove it?
Again, I don't like that word artificial. Like, why would it be artificial? Even if it is a simulation and I'm a part of that simulation, then it is as real as I am, and therefore it's real to me, the best way I can explain it. So maybe I'm splitting hairs there, but it's not artificial. It's not an illusion. It is real. It's just the question of how do we describe what that is. Let's get into some C.S. Lewis. So this is Doug Wilson explaining the Ransom trilogy that C.S. Lewis wrote. And I find that some maybe evangelical Christians are shocked to find out what is actually written in the Bible. And that's part of the reason why I'm doing these podcasts is I want to explore those things. I'm not worried about those things. I do come at these questions from a biblical Christian worldview. And I find mysterious things to be fascinating. And so I love that I get to share this with you. If you're at this point in the video and you haven't subscribed yet, I would ask you to subscribe and just be a part of the community, chat. That's what it really is about, is share this with somebody if you already have subscribed. I think that there are a lot of people who benefit from exploring these conversations. And so if you're one of those, I'm glad you're here. If you know people like that, I'm glad that you're sharing this video with them. And so Doug's going to break down sort of C.S. Lewis's approach here to, he doesn't call it simulation theory, but you'll start to pick up on the themes that are repeated.
The Ransom trilogy is a popularization in modern garb of the medieval cosmology, which in its turn was a restatement of the biblical cosmology. So you have biblical cosmology, a variation on that, which is the medieval cosmology, and Lewis's cosmology is a modern version of the medieval cosmology, which is a version of the biblical cosmology. There are adjustments, there are variations, but it's recognizably the same in all three categories.
Yeah, so not exactly the same, but the medieval cosmology is an outworking of the biblical cosmology. And we have been told in our modern day that we have to reject the ancient cosmology, that, that's outdated, since Copernicus, and we need to get rid of all those crazy ideas. And yet here we are coming up with simulation theory, which, as you will see, is not that much different, I think.
There are many modern believers who hold themselves to be Bible believers, but who would recoil in embarrassment from a straightforward reading of what the Star of Bethlehem was actually supposed to have done. The text says explicitly that the star singles out a house, points out the house. They found the house where Jesus and the baby Jesus and where Mary and Joseph were, because the star showed them the way. Either the account is false, some sort of crazy story, mythological legend sort of thing, or the wise men were doing some serious astrology, or a star in some way, shape, or form came down into our atmosphere and led the way to the house. In which case, stars are not what we assume them to be. Stars are, at the very least, more than what we generally assume them to be.
Okay. So that story of the birth of Jesus, again, taken for what it is, and just read the Bible for what it is. I know some people will say, well, you could swing the pendulum too far and say none of it's literal. You could swing the pendulum too far and say it's all literal, there's nothing figurative about it. Or you could just take it seriously for what it's saying and then ask this question. Let it lead you to this conclusion that maybe stars are more than what we assume they are. We can explain what a star is naturalistically, and that's true, but is that a full picture of what a star actually is? Because the Bible is telling us that a star came down from heaven and pointed out where Jesus was. And that these wise men doing astronomy and astrology, which are kind of more closely related in ancient times than we would think of them today, figured out what that star was doing, figured out what the stars were doing. You can look at Michael Heiser's video on this. And they knew that the stars, the heavens, were telling something about this birth. And so I think we need to expand our understanding of what things are beyond the natural realm. That doesn't mean we disregard the natural and say, well, since we've explained what a star is, that's the end of the story. It appears that God might have designed stars and other things to be a little bit more than just what the naturalistic world could tell us they are.
Consider the physical structure of the world. And by world, I mean universe, what we would say universe. This is Lewis from that essay I mentioned, Imagination and Thought. Lewis, I assume that everyone knows, more or less, its material layout. A motionless Earth at the center, transparent spheres revolving around it, of which the lowest, slowest, nearest, and smallest carries the moon, and thence upward in the order Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. Beyond these, all the stars in one sphere. Beyond that, a sphere which carries no light, but merely imparts movement to those below it. That sphere is the clutch. Okay, that's the gear that makes it all go. Beyond that, the Empyrean, the boundary of the mundus, the boundary of the world, the beginning of the infinite, true heaven. Okay, so what you have is a motionless Earth at the center.
Okay, so he's explaining Lewis's vision of the cosmos, okay, which is kind of tied to this medieval vision, which is tied to the biblical, even though there's differentiation along the way.
Have transparent spheres. Now think of it this way. You've got the Earth here, and then around it, we're not talking about a sphere as in a circle. We're talking about a sphere as in a globe. So picture the Earth at the center, and then a goldfish bowl, or one of those glass things that fishermen use in their nets, a little round glass ball. So you have a glass ball that completely encases the Earth. So That would be the Earth at the center, then the glass case, glass, quotation marks around it. And
Yeah, and of course, when we went into quote-unquote outer space, we didn't hit this sort of sphere that we, ancient people would have thought about. And so, therefore, we've disproven it, right? And maybe in abandoning that, we've actually lost something of a better explanation. So it's true that there's not this sort of glass, quote-unquote, glass sphere, but is it still true in some other sense that the world does orientate this way? Or that if we can tolerate an explanation of the world orientated this way, that we would actually benefit in our understanding of that world.
And embedded in the wall of the glass is a marble. That marble is the moon. Okay, so you have the Earth, glass sphere surrounding the Earth, and embedded in the side of the glass sphere is a marble called the moon. Then you go one out, you've got, this whole thing is like a Russian doll. All right, so.
Okay, so there it is. I mean, he's describing what Neil deGrasse Tyson described, except, of course, Neil deGrasse Tyson would utterly reject the ancient cosmology of medieval times and beyond. And he's going to have to come up with his own cosmology now. He's going to have to come up with his own way of describing existence, all that is. So what does he do? He uses computer language. And he says, well, if we're in a computer simulation, maybe somebody in that computer simulation invents a computer and then invents a simulation within the simulation. And the whole thing is like Russian nesting dolls. And we have to do that because we've rejected the spiritual reality. So is it true that there's these glass spheres? No, not technically. But is it true that the natural world is all there is? No, I don't think that's a good explanation for reality either. We've disregarded that supernatural dimension, and now we're waffling to try to explain how the world works the way it does if that supernatural dimension doesn't exist. So the modern reductionist attempt to get away from the ancient myths and legends has invented its own nearly identical cosmology, just in naturalistic language.